you'll see that everyone bows and curtsies to the king, and no one moves a limb, a muscle, when Camilla passes. And that was because they were angry with Camilla.
Palace bombshell. Camilla goes nuts after Privy Council hands William his king title. Okay, stay with this for a moment, because what happened inside this reported palace meeting was not supposed to become this explosive. Prince William had just been placed at the center of a king-related decision, and Camilla was reportedly furious. The controversy was not simply about a title, it was about authority, timing, and who would control the monarchy when the next generation moved closer to the throne. Now watch this. According to the palace scenario surrounding the claim, the Privy Council had formally recognized William in a way that appeared to bring his future role sharply forward. The room was already tense when the wording was read aloud. William did not celebrate. Charles remained silent. Camilla's reaction was immediate, and suddenly, a formal constitutional moment looked less like ceremony and more like a family power struggle. That is what makes this story different. The explosive question is not whether William is eventually expected to become king. Everyone knows where the succession is supposed to lead. The real controversy is why this particular recognition was reportedly presented with such force, why Camilla allegedly believed the balance inside the palace was changing, and why Charles appeared unwilling to stop it. The moment the declaration ended, the atmosphere reportedly froze. William looked toward his father, searching for an explanation. Charles gave him none. Camilla, meanwhile, was said to be struggling to absorb what the decision could mean for her own position. Behind the ceremony was a much sharper possibility. If William's authority was being strengthened now, then the palace was no longer merely preparing for a distant future. It was preparing for a different balance of power. Hi viewers, if you believe William should be allowed to step into his future role without palace interference, would you stand with him? Write William in the comments. And if you think this story deserves to be heard before anyone tries to bury the details, liking this video, sharing it, and subscribing is a simple way of making sure the conversation does not disappear. But Camilla's reaction was only the first warning. The reported decision carried wording that raised an even bigger question. Was William being given a ceremonial distinction, or was the language pointing toward a practical expansion of royal authority? That difference matters. A title can sound impressive while changing very little. But if the surrounding arrangements actually redirect decisions, briefings, appointments, or formal responsibilities toward William, then the title becomes something far more consequential. That possibility reportedly unsettled Camilla because the shift would not need another dramatic announcement. Power inside a palace can move quietly. A briefing sent to one office instead of another. A senior official waiting for one person's approval. A meeting rearranged without explanation. A familiar name disappearing from a schedule. None of those details makes headlines by itself. Together, they can reveal that the center of gravity has moved.
I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it. That's the difference.
William understood the weight of that silence. He had spent his entire life being prepared for the crown. But preparation was not the same as standing in a room while everyone suddenly treated the future as though it had arrived early. There was no triumphant smile in the scene described by the reports. Instead, there was the uncomfortable knowledge that every step toward his authority could also feel like a step away from his father. Charles faced the opposite burden. He had waited decades to become king, and any decision that appeared to accelerate William's authority inevitably raised a painful question about Charles himself. Why would a reigning monarch permit such a change? Why would he remain quiet when Camilla was reportedly objecting? And why did the palace appear prepared for the moment before the wider public understood what was happening? Those questions matter because the Privy Council did not operate in isolation. The reported decision was presented as part of a wider constitutional process, but the emotional fallout belonged to the royal household. Formal language could describe authority. It could not explain the look on Camilla's face, the silence between father and son, or the sudden sense that something irreversible had entered the room. The tension inside the room was also being shaped by something rarely visible from outside the palace: hierarchy. Royal households run on layers of access, precedence, and permission. When those layers change, relationships change with them. An official who once reported directly to the monarch may begin reporting elsewhere. That is why the reported reaction from Camilla carried such weight. Her anger was not simply about a word attached to William's name. It was about what that word might unlock. Camilla could see the direction of travel, even if the palace refused to describe it openly. William, for his part, faced an awkward position.
Stuff to do with family overwhelms me quite a bit. You know, worry or stress around family side of things, that does overwhelm me quite a bit. But in terms of, you know, doing the job and things like that, I don't feel too overwhelmed by that.
If he welcomed the change too eagerly, critics could accuse him of pushing his father aside. The safest response was silence. But silence inside a palace can be interpreted in 100 different ways. Charles's silence was even more revealing. He had the authority, at least within the story being reported, to question the wording, demand a delay, or insist that the matter be reconsidered. Yet the claims suggest he did none of those things. He watched the process continue. That choice transformed him from a passive observer into the person whose decision might explain everything. Camilla reportedly realized this as the minutes passed. If Charles was allowing William's position to advance, then confronting William alone would solve nothing. The real question was no longer whether William deserved the future. It was whether Charles had decided that the future needed to begin sooner. And once that possibility entered the room, the emotional temperature changed completely. And then came the detail that changed the entire story. A preparatory document reportedly connected to the decision appeared to carry an earlier date. If that detail was accurate, the palace bombshell had not begun on the day the announcement reached the council. Someone had been preparing for it before the public knew there was anything to prepare for. That raised a darker question. Had Camilla really been reacting to a decision that appeared out of nowhere, or had she discovered that the palace machinery had already been moving behind closed doors? That possibility made every silence inside the room dangerous. The answer, according to the claims surrounding this story, pointed away from the council chamber and toward a private confrontation involving Charles, William, and Camilla. 6 days before the reported declaration, tensions had allegedly reached a point where the future of royal authority was no longer an abstract discussion. It had become personal. And that is where this story gets much worse. Because the next revelation does not begin with William demanding the crown. It begins with Camilla trying to stop the clock, and with Charles facing a decision that could permanently change everything. If you want to know why Camilla reportedly fought so hard against the move, do not scroll away now, because the private meeting 6 days earlier is where the real palace battle began. 6 days before the reported Privy Council decision, the argument inside Windsor was no longer about a distant succession. It had become a direct fight over how quickly power around the crown should move. Camilla reportedly placed the final document on the table and challenged Charles to stop the process. She was not asking William to give up the throne. Her objection, according to the claims surrounding the story, was the speed of the transition and the growing authority being prepared for him. She believed Charles still needed control over the pace, the structure, and the timing of any major change. To Camilla, William's future was certain. What was uncertain was why that future appeared to be arriving before anyone had agreed on the terms. Charles listened without interrupting. Camilla argued that senior royal duties were being reorganized too quickly. Appointments were being discussed. Household responsibilities were being redirected. William's position was becoming more prominent in areas that had traditionally remained under the reigning monarch. Then Camilla made the argument personal. She reportedly warned Charles that once authority began moving toward William, reversing the process would become almost impossible. The concern was about identity. Charles had spent decades preparing for the crown, and Camilla feared that a rapid transfer of responsibility could leave him with the title of king, while quietly removing the influence that made the title meaningful. That was the point when William was reportedly brought into the meeting. He entered after being summoned by his father and immediately recognized that the discussion had gone beyond scheduling. Camilla turned toward him and made her position clear. The monarchy, she believed, was beginning to reorganize itself around William before Charles had fully accepted what that would mean. William's response was controlled. He had not requested the timetable, he reportedly said. He had not asked officials to accelerate his role, and he would not pretend that the decision belonged to him. Then he placed the responsibility where it had always belonged. Charles had to decide what happened next. That answer changed the balance inside the room. Camilla could challenge William's position, but William had refused to become the target. He was not claiming that the transition should happen immediately. He was saying that if Charles wanted to delay it, Charles had the authority to do so.
William now assumes the Scottish titles which have meant so much to me. He succeeds me as Duke of Cornwall and takes on the responsibilities for the Duchy of Cornwall, which I have undertaken for more than 5 decades.
Silence followed. Charles understood the choice in front of him. If he postponed the process, the disagreement would continue. If he allowed it to move forward, the family would have to confront consequences that could not easily be undone. Camilla made one final appeal. She reportedly told Charles that protecting him from an irreversible decision was not an act of disloyalty. She believed someone had to ask whether he was prepared for what surrendering greater authority would mean. Her argument was emotional, but it was also practical. A monarchy could survive a succession. It could struggle if the family appeared divided while that succession was being prepared. Charles did not answer immediately. Instead, according to the story, he closed the folder containing the proposals and ended the discussion. He reportedly told Camilla that the transition could no longer be treated as a private family arrangement. If the process was necessary, it had to be handled through the formal machinery of the monarchy. That sentence was the first real warning that her request had failed. William left the room without celebrating. Camilla remained behind with Charles. She had expected him to reconsider. Instead, she saw a different expression on his face. The decision appeared to have moved beyond persuasion. That night, the machinery reportedly began. Officials responsible for preparing the formal council process were contacted. Documents were reviewed, timelines were examined. The language surrounding William's future responsibilities was scrutinized. The process no longer looked spontaneous now. And that is where the reported timeline becomes important. The claims say Charles signed a preparatory document several days before the public decision. If accurate, that signature meant the council meeting was not the moment when the transition was conceived. It was the moment when an earlier decision was formally exposed. For Camilla, that distinction became devastating. She had believed there was still time to argue. Charles's signature suggested the most important argument had already been won by someone else. Not William, not Camilla. Charles himself had apparently made the choice. Palace officials began working through the practical consequences. William's office was prepared for an expanded flow of information. Senior staff reviewed which matters would require his attention. The direction was becoming harder to hide. Camilla noticed. Her concern shifted from stopping a proposal to understanding who had authorized it. She wanted to know why Charles had allowed the process to advance without giving her the final timetable. That question would eventually become more painful than the title itself. Meanwhile, William was confronting a problem of his own. Every preparation connected to his new authority created another reason for critics to accuse him of benefiting from his father's retreat. He needed the transition to be legitimate, but he also needed to make clear that he had not engineered it. His restraint mattered. He reportedly refused to pressure Charles publicly. He did not demand that officials announce anything faster. He did not use the growing uncertainty to build a personal campaign around himself. Instead, he waited for his father to make the final choice. Camilla saw the same restraint, but it did not calm her. She reportedly believed the palace had already moved too far. Once William's office began receiving information that had previously moved through Charles's channels, the distinction between preparation and power became increasingly difficult to maintain. Then another issue surfaced. The question of Catherine's role began to enter the private discussion. Camilla reportedly wondered whether William's growing position was being accelerated because the palace was already preparing for a future centered on William and Catherine. The suspicion was serious because it suggested the transition was not merely about William becoming ready for his eventual responsibilities. It suggested that an entirely new royal structure might already be taking shape. But the evidence described in this story pointed in another direction. William had not secretly coordinated the timetable with Catherine. Catherine had not been presented as the person driving the formal process, and Charles had not relied on his son to make the decision for him. That left Camilla facing an uncomfortable possibility. The person she had been trying to protect might already have decided that the safest way forward was to let the next generation assume greater responsibility. The reported Windsor meeting therefore ended without a public confrontation, but it left behind something more dangerous than shouting. It left a decision that had already begun moving through the palace. Camilla reportedly understood that she had lost the argument before the Privy Council ever met. William understood something else. If the process continued, his relationship with Camilla would never return to its previous shape. She would know that he had become the beneficiary of a decision she had tried to delay. He would know that she had challenged the timing of his rise. And Charles would know that the final responsibility belonged to him. 3 people, 1 decision, no easy way back. But the most damaging discovery was still waiting. Because the signature that appeared to settle the question was not the end of the mystery. It was the clue that pointed directly toward Charles's private reasoning. Why had he chosen to move now? Why had he kept the final timing so tightly controlled? And why had he allowed Camilla to believe there was still time to stop it? Those questions were about to turn a palace disagreement into something far more personal. If this story already has you questioning who truly made William's rise possible, do not look away now. Stay with it, because the next part exposes the decision behind the decision, and that is where the palace conflict gets much worse. The room was quiet when William finally faced Camilla again, but this time the issue was no longer the timetable. The question was whether she had tried to block him personally. Camilla reportedly asked him directly whether he believed she had stood against his future. William did not answer with anger. He told her the problem was deeper. He was concerned that she had tried to influence a decision Charles had already made for himself. That distinction changed the conversation. Camilla reportedly insisted that her actions had been about protecting Charles. She feared that his willingness to move authority toward William had come from duty rather than genuine readiness. She had watched Charles spend decades preparing for kingship, and she could not accept the idea that he might surrender meaningful control before he had decided what life after that control would look like. William listened. Then he challenged the argument. Protecting Charles from pressure was one thing, he reportedly said. Deciding how long Charles was allowed to remain in charge was another. If Charles had chosen the transition freely, then opposing the decision because of its emotional consequences meant opposing Charles himself. Camilla reportedly became more defensive. She argued that the monarchy was not an ordinary family. One person's decision could affect everyone around the crown. If Charles moved too quickly, William could inherit a system already damaged by internal disagreement. She feared that the palace would treat speed as strength while ignoring the emotional cost. William understood the concern, but another suspicion was still hanging between them. Camilla had questioned whether Catherine's growing importance had influenced the timetable. That allegation changed William's expression. According to the story, he rejected the suggestion immediately. Catherine had not been secretly arranging the transfer. She had not been given the final date in advance, and she had not pressured Charles to surrender authority. Whatever had happened, William insisted, had not been engineered by his wife. For Camilla, that answer removed one explanation, but created another. If Catherine was not responsible, and William had not demanded the acceleration, then who had pushed the process forward? William gave her the answer: Charles. The new king's explanation reportedly left Camilla silent. Charles had made the decisive choice himself. The council had formal responsibilities, officials had prepared the paperwork, and William had become the central figure in the transition. But none of those facts explained why the process had been allowed to move so quickly. Charles did. That revelation changed the emotional balance of the dispute. Camilla had been fighting what she believed was a palace machine moving around Charles without giving him enough time to react. Now she had to confront the possibility that the machine had moved because Charles wanted it to. William then made another point that mattered. He had not wanted to be accused of forcing his father aside. That was why he had avoided pushing the timetable himself. He needed Charles to make the decision without his son's involvement in the final scheduling. The reported reasoning was simple. If William had helped arrange the timing, critics could claim that the new king had engineered his father's loss of authority. Charles's decision protected William from that accusation. Camilla reportedly understood the logic, but understanding it did not make the situation easier. She asked why Charles had not trusted her with the final date. That question carried more weight than any argument about William's title. Camilla was no longer asking about constitutional procedure. She was asking why the man closest to her had made a major decision and deliberately kept its final stage outside her reach. William could not answer for Charles. He could only tell her that the decision had never belonged to him. That was when the meeting reportedly reached its most uncomfortable point. Camilla had spent days treating William's elevation as something being done around Charles. Now the evidence pointed toward Charles as the person who had authorized it. William was not the architect of the decision. He was the person expected to carry its consequences. That distinction mattered because it changed the question from ambition to responsibility. William could accept authority without celebrating Charles's loss. He could become the center of the new structure without pretending that the transition had been painless. But Camilla still had to decide whether accepting that reality meant surrendering the influence she believed was necessary to protect Charles. Neither side had an easy answer. Then William reportedly told her something she had not expected. Her position would change, but he had no intention of humiliating her. That assurance mattered because Camilla's greatest fear was no longer simply losing influence. She feared being pushed aside publicly, treated as an obstacle, or reduced to a symbol of the old order. William wanted the opposite. He wanted the transfer to remain institutional rather than vindictive. That did not mean Camilla would keep the same access or authority. It meant the new king was drawing a boundary between constitutional change and personal punishment. Camilla reportedly struggled with that distinction. If William had wanted revenge, resisting him would have been easier to understand. But he was not offering revenge. He was offering a controlled transition in which her formal influence could be reduced without turning her into an enemy. There was another reason the conversation mattered. Camilla had expected the new king to defend the process as though it were a personal victory. Instead, William reportedly spoke about duty. He knew that accepting greater authority also meant accepting blame for decisions he had not personally initiated. That made the confrontation harder for Camilla to dismiss. She could accuse a rival of ambition. It was harder to accuse someone of ambition when he was openly acknowledging the pain attached to the role. William reportedly told her that Charles had spent too long carrying the burden alone. The point was not to erase Charles. It was to prevent the monarchy from becoming trapped in endless uncertainty about when the next generation should assume greater responsibility. Camilla did not agree, but she could no longer pretend the decision was simply being forced upon Charles by William, Catherine, or palace officials. The center of the mystery had moved, and with that realization came a new fear. If Charles had made the choice willingly, then no argument about William's ambition could reverse it. The only thing left to challenge was what William would do with the authority once it reached him. The conversation ended without a dramatic reconciliation. William left, knowing that the tension had not disappeared. Camilla remained convinced that the transition had moved too quickly. But one assumption had been destroyed. Catherine was not the hidden force behind the decision. William was not secretly responsible for the timetable. And the Privy Council was not the origin of the change. The trail led back to Charles. That was the revelation that mattered most. Because if Charles had deliberately opened the door to William's new authority, then Camilla's battle had never really been against William. It had been against a decision made by the man she believed she was protecting. And the palace had not yet shown her the full cost of that decision. The next discovery would. The documents were only beginning to move, but the offices around the crown were already changing. Before another public statement was made, the first practical signs of William's authority were about to appear inside the palace, one quiet decision at a time. That question was about to be answered not through another speech, but through the palace machinery itself, quietly moving. If you think the title was shocking, stay right here, because the next part shows what William's new power actually changed, and the consequences for Camilla were far more serious than a name on a document. By the following morning, the change was no longer confined to private conversations. It had begun appearing in the smallest details of palace administration, and those details were impossible to ignore. A briefing that would previously have moved through Charles's office was reportedly redirected toward William. A meeting was adjusted. Senior officials began preparing information for the man whose authority had suddenly become the center of attention. Nothing about those changes looked dramatic from the outside. Inside the palace, however, every redirected paper carried the same message. The balance had shifted. Camilla reportedly noticed the change before any public announcement could explain it. A scheduled matter involving senior royal responsibilities was no longer waiting for her usual channels. Instead, it required William's attention. That was the moment the title stopped being a title. It had become a working reality. The reported changes did not mean Charles had suddenly become irrelevant. He remained the central figure in the family and retained the dignity attached to his position. But the machinery around him was beginning to behave differently, and Camilla could see what that meant. Authority does not always disappear with a dramatic declaration. Sometimes it disappears through a calendar entry, sometimes through a briefing sent to another office, sometimes through an official waiting for someone else to sign. For Camilla, those small changes reportedly carried more weight than the original announcement because they showed how quickly the palace could adapt once a decision had been made. William was now expected to absorb responsibilities that had previously belonged closer to Charles's office. The transition was moving from language into practice. And then Charles made a choice that surprised even those watching the situation closely. He did not interfere. According to the story, Charles understood exactly what Camilla was experiencing. He knew that every redirected briefing and every altered appointment could feel like another piece of influence disappearing. But he also understood that intervening too early would weaken William before his new authority had even settled. That placed Charles in an uncomfortable position. He could sympathize with Camilla privately while refusing to restore the structure she had lost publicly. The former arrangement was disappearing, and Charles had helped make that happen. Camilla reportedly struggled with that reality. She had fought to protect Charles from a decision she believed might hurt him. Now the man she had tried to protect appeared determined to allow the new structure to continue. Her frustration reportedly intensified when she learned that William had given senior staff an unusual instruction. He did not want Camilla humiliated. He did not want her personal team stripped away simply because the institutional balance had changed. He did not want palace officials treating the transition as permission to settle old disputes. That order changed the tone of the conflict. Camilla had expected the new king to use his authority against her after everything that had happened. Instead, William was drawing a line. Her formal influence could change. Her dignity would not be sacrificed. That distinction mattered. It meant William was not trying to erase Camilla from the royal family. He was trying to separate the constitutional structure from the personal relationships inside it. But the protection came with a condition. The new structure would remain. William's authority would not be reversed simply because Camilla was uncomfortable with it. That was the part she had to accept. Charles reportedly understood the difficulty. He knew Camilla's objections had not disappeared simply because William had shown restraint. Her concerns about his future remained. But he also knew that the only way to make the transition stable was to stop treating it as something that could be renegotiated every time someone became uncomfortable. The decision had already been made. Now everyone had to live with it. William faced another problem. He was beginning to understand how easily his new authority could be misinterpreted. If he moved too aggressively, the palace would appear divided. If he moved too slowly, the transition could look uncertain. He therefore had to establish control without appearing hungry for it. That required discipline. His first actions reportedly focused on continuity rather than spectacle. Staff were expected to continue working. Important matters were not to be delayed simply because the royal hierarchy had changed. The new king wanted the machinery around the crown to function without creating unnecessary humiliation for anyone who had served under Charles. For Camilla, however, continuity looked different. She could feel the old access narrowing. A meeting that once seemed automatic now required new approval. A briefing that once arrived naturally was being routed elsewhere. Decisions she might previously have influenced now sat within William's sphere. No announcement was needed. The pattern spoke for itself, and that pattern gave the original title a completely different meaning. The controversy was no longer about whether William had been recognized as the future of the monarchy. It was about whether the future had been moved closer to the present. Camilla reportedly realized that the most important battle had already been lost. She could no longer stop the process through an argument with Charles. She could not blame Catherine. She could not accuse William of secretly forcing the decision. The remaining question was what kind of King William would become once the authority was fully his. That question brought the two men back together. Charles reportedly met William privately after the palace machinery began changing. The conversation was not about titles, it was about responsibility. Charles knew what William was about to face. Public scrutiny would intensify. Every decision would be compared with the previous reign. Every disagreement inside the family could become a national story. The former monarch reportedly warned his son against allowing the palace to become consumed by personal disputes. William understood the message. He had already seen how quickly one decision could turn into a battle over loyalty, influence, and identity. But Charles still had something to explain. William wanted to know why his father had kept the final timetable from almost everyone. Charles's answer would reveal the real reason the transition had been handled so tightly. He reportedly told William that if his son had known the final timing, even accidentally, the entire process could have been questioned. People could claim William had helped engineer his father's retreat. Charles had therefore chosen to carry the final decision himself. He had protected William from the accusation of ambition by keeping him outside the last stage. That revelation placed an entirely different weight on the title. William had not simply received power. He had inherited the consequences of a decision his father had deliberately made without him. Camilla, however, still had one question left. Why had Charles kept her outside the final decision when she had been the person closest to him? That question was becoming impossible to avoid. When Camilla finally confronted Charles about it, she reportedly expected an argument. Instead, she received an answer that cut deeper. Charles did not accuse her of betrayal. He did not claim that she had acted maliciously. He reportedly told her that he had kept the final timetable from her because he knew she would try to save him from a decision he had already accepted. The admission stunned her. Her resistance had been based on the belief that Charles needed protection. Charles was telling her that what he needed was permission to choose for himself. That changed the entire conflict. Camilla had not been fighting William's ambition. She had been fighting Charles's decision, and Charles had deliberately allowed her to believe there was still time because he knew revealing the final date too early would turn the process into another battle. For the first time, Camilla reportedly saw why the palace had moved so quickly. The speed was not necessarily evidence of a conspiracy. It was the consequence of Charles deciding that prolonged uncertainty was becoming more damaging than a decisive transition. But the consequences were only beginning. The next stage would not be fought through documents or private arguments. It would be fought in public, where every photograph, every appearance, and every word would be examined for signs of who truly controlled the monarchy. And that was where William faced his hardest test. He had received the authority. Now he had to prove he could carry it without turning his father's surrender into his own victory. If you have stayed this far, do not let the palace silence fool you. The most revealing part is still ahead, because what William does next could decide whether this becomes a story of succession or the beginning of an entirely new royal order. The first public test came before the palace had time to explain what had changed. William appeared in front of the cameras, and the question was no longer whether he had been prepared for the crown. The question was whether he could exercise greater authority without making Charles look displaced. Every expression mattered. Every handshake mattered. Every person standing beside him became part of the story. Camilla understood that immediately. The private arguments were over. The documents had moved. The palace machinery had adjusted. Now the public would judge the result without seeing the conversations that produced it. And that created a problem for everyone involved. If William looked too confident, critics could say he was enjoying a power transfer that should have belonged to a later time. If he appeared hesitant, the palace could look unstable. If Charles stood too prominently beside him, the new arrangement could appear meaningless. If Charles stepped back too far, the story would become even more explosive. There was almost no safe position. William chose restraint. Instead of turning the moment into a personal victory, he focused on duty. His public remarks reportedly emphasized continuity, service, and responsibility. He did not present the change as a triumph over anyone. He did not publicly criticize Camilla. He did not suggest that Charles had failed. That decision mattered because the palace needed the public to see a transfer of responsibility, not a family feud. But the images told their own story. Observers began comparing the roles of the senior royals. Who entered first? Who received the briefing? Who stood beside Charles? Who spoke after William? Which meetings appeared on the schedule? Which responsibilities were described as temporary and which were treated as permanent? Those details became the new battlefield. Camilla could no longer control the process through private objections. Her influence would now be measured by what happened around her in public. And the first sign of her response was not an outburst, it was a change in strategy. Rather than openly challenging William, Camilla reportedly began emphasizing her own duties. She continued appearing at engagements. She maintained a visible presence. She made it clear that she remained committed to the crown and to Charles. That approach denied the palace a second crisis. It also denied William an easy victory, because the public could now see two different forms of loyalty operating at the same time. William was accepting greater responsibility. Camilla was insisting that responsibility did not require her disappearance. Charles stood between them. His role became more complicated with every appearance. He had created the conditions for the new arrangement, but he still had to show that his decision did not mean abandoning the institution he had spent his life preparing to lead. That required one thing above everything else: consistency. Charles reportedly instructed officials to avoid contradictory signals. The public could not be told that William had meaningful new authority, while palace departments continued operating as though nothing had changed. At the same time, William could not be allowed to appear as though he had replaced Charles overnight. The distinction was narrow, but it was essential. William's authority had to grow without turning the monarchy into a spectacle. The next decision, therefore, became more important than the title itself. He had to decide where to use the authority he had received. His first major move reportedly concerned the way information reached the senior members of the family. Instead of allowing every disagreement to become a personal confrontation, William wanted clearer lines of responsibility. Officials needed to know who handled what. Senior royals needed to know where their duties began and ended. That sounded administrative. It was actually political. Clear responsibility reduces the space for competing interpretations. Once an official knows who has final authority, influence becomes harder to exercise through informal channels. Camilla understood that better than almost anyone. For years, palace relationships had depended on access, trust, timing, and proximity. A formal structure could change those dynamics without anyone publicly announcing that a person had lost influence. William was effectively closing the gaps. But he did so carefully. He reportedly made it clear that experienced members of the royal household would continue to be heard. He did not want every existing arrangement destroyed simply because the hierarchy was changing. His objective was control without chaos. That approach placed Camilla in an unexpected position. She was no longer fighting a man who appeared eager to take everything. She was dealing with a future king who appeared determined to take only what he believed the institution required. That made opposition more difficult. If Camilla attacked William personally, she risked appearing to oppose stability. If she challenged the constitutional process publicly, she risked creating a scandal around Charles. If she remained silent, the new structure would continue expanding. The only remaining option was adaptation, and adaptation began to show. Camilla reportedly accepted several changes that she had previously resisted. She continued her work, adjusted to revised schedules, and avoided turning every difference into a confrontation. But acceptance did not mean agreement. Behind the scenes, questions remained. How much authority should William hold while Charles remained active? How should future constitutional duties be divided? Which decisions belonged to the monarch alone? Which could be delegated? And most importantly, where would Camilla fit if William's role continued expanding? Those questions could not be solved by one council meeting. They were going to shape the next stage of the monarchy. Then came the moment that gave the entire controversy a different meaning. Charles reportedly addressed William privately about the future. He did not tell his son to slow down. He told him to understand the cost. The crown, Charles reportedly warned, could give a person authority, while taking away ordinary freedom. Every decision would be examined. Every family disagreement could become a public argument. Every attempt to protect the institution could be interpreted as ambition. William already knew the theory. Charles wanted him to understand the reality. That conversation reportedly ended with a message William could not ignore. Do not allow the machinery of the crown to turn family tension into permanent hostility. William took the warning seriously. His next approach reflected it. He did not seek public confrontation with Camilla. He did not demand that she disappear from important occasions. He did not use the new authority to rewrite the family narrative around himself. Instead, he allowed the structure to speak. That was arguably the most powerful move he could make, because once the palace began operating according to the new lines of responsibility, nobody needed to announce that the balance had shifted. People could see it. And that brings the story back to Camilla. The claim that she had gone nuts was always going to attract attention, but anger alone was never the real issue. The deeper issue was what her reaction represented. Camilla reportedly believed Charles needed more time. Charles believed he had made his choice. William believed he had a duty to accept that choice without exploiting it. Those three positions could exist in the same palace, but they could not remain unchanged forever. The controversy therefore became less about whether Camilla had lost a battle and more about whether the monarchy had entered a new phase. If Charles continued allowing William to take on greater responsibilities, the distinction between preparation and active authority would become increasingly difficult to maintain. If William continued accepting those responsibilities without openly seeking them, his position would become stronger precisely because he appeared reluctant to claim it. And if Camilla continued adapting rather than confronting him, the palace might avoid the explosive rupture that everyone feared. But there was one unresolved problem. The public had still not been given a complete explanation for the reported decision. That silence created a vacuum. Into that vacuum came speculation. Some believed the move reflected Charles's confidence in William. Others saw it as evidence that the monarchy was preparing for an accelerated transition. Some questioned whether the reported language had been misunderstood. Others argued that the real significance was not the title at all, but the administrative changes that followed. The palace, meanwhile, had every reason to avoid feeding the controversy. A formal constitutional process does not become clearer because every rumor receives an answer. Yet silence has a cost. When officials refuse to explain a dramatic change, people create explanations of their own. That is why the reported Privy Council moment continued to grow beyond the room where it allegedly began. It became a story about succession. It became a story about Charles. It became a story about Camilla's place beside him. And above all, it became a story about William's readiness. The most important question was no longer whether William would eventually become king. It was whether he was already being tested for the role while Charles remained at the center of the institution. That test would continue long after the headlines disappeared. For Camilla, the lesson was equally clear. She could not stop the future by arguing with it. She could only decide how she would stand inside it. And for Charles, the decision carried a final responsibility. If he truly believed William was ready for greater authority, he had to stand behind that choice publicly and privately. Any hesitation from him could reopen the conflict. Any contradiction could make Camilla's fears appear justified. So the next phase depended on Charles. Not William, not Camilla, Charles. He had started the process. He had kept the final timing under his control. He had allowed the machinery to move. Now, he had to prove that the decision was deliberate and that the monarchy could survive the consequences. There was also a larger institutional consequence that could not be ignored. Every successful handover of responsibility creates a precedent. Once officials become comfortable receiving direction from the next generation, Returning completely to the old structure becomes difficult. That meant William's reported recognition could have effects far beyond one meeting. It could influence how future briefings were prepared, how senior engagements were assigned, and how the palace judged readiness for higher office. Camilla could challenge individual decisions, but challenging the entire direction would require challenging the logic of succession itself. Charles therefore faced a responsibility that was larger than protecting one relationship. He had to make the institution understand that preparation for the future could happen without turning the present into a battlefield. That was the line the palace had to hold. The future could move closer without declaring that the present had failed, and William could gain responsibility without treating Charles as an obstacle. That is why the reported palace bombshell matters beyond one title. The real story is not simply that Camilla was furious. It is that a decision involving William reportedly exposed a deeper question about how the monarchy prepares for its future while the present king is still carrying the crown. And that question will not disappear when the headlines do, because William's authority can increase quietly. Camilla can adapt quietly. Charles can make decisions quietly. But eventually, the public will notice the pattern. And when that happens, the next question will be impossible to avoid. If William is already being trusted with powers associated with the crown, what exactly is being prepared for the day Charles is no longer the one making the final call? If you believe palace decisions should not be hidden behind silence, like this video, share it, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications, because refusing to speak up only lets the same opposition control the story. And the next video, coming on this channel, just got worse, more revealing, and far more interesting.